Hello, everybody, and welcome to Stat Chasing Week 11. We are in the midst of the NFL season. My name is Sam Hoppen, and I am your host for the show. The fantasy football playoffs are right around the corner for everyone, and hope to get you all prepared for this upcoming week for the playoff stretch as well. If you haven't watched the show before, first of all, thank you for tuning in. This is where I go through some of the key stats that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week, the past several weeks, for my own edification in helping set my lineups and understand what's going to happen in the upcoming week. But before I get into the nitty-gritty details of all of the data, I want to share the sources of the stats that I'll be walking through. So from PFF, I get all of my routes data. So that's any route-specific metrics, targets per out run, route rate, things like that. I also use their expected fantasy points, which is a model built that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage and where a player is targeted, where they get a carry, stuff like that. And I use this primarily as a measure of usage to understand which players are getting the most high value opportunities in their offense and potentially are or are not making the most of those opportunities. Where I get the majority of my stats, though, are from NFL Faster, which is the NFL's play-by-play data. I get air yards from there, which is the distance the ball traveled in the air before it gets to a receiver. Weighted opportunity rating, a metric that Josh Hermsmeyer created a couple years ago that weights target share and air yard share. Also have receiver air conversion ratio, which is receiving yards divided by air yards, and is an efficiency metric showing a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. Also have pacer on the flip side, which is passing air conversion ratio, which is passing yards divided by passing air yards, and shows a quarterback or his receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. Also have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but is weighted with interceptions and touchdowns. And then have a couple of expectation-based stats. First of all, have pass rate over expectation. In NFL Faster, they've created a model that identifies the percent chance that a play is going to be a drop back or a pass for a team. And then you can use that to calculate a team's expected pass rate and then subtract that from their actual pass rate to get pass rate over expectation. Similarly, have completion percentage over expectations, or CPOE, which is a quarterback's, again, expected completion percentage, or their actual completion percentage over expected. And again, is an efficiency type metric for quarterbacks. Also have a couple of stats popularized by Ben Gretsch, friend of the show, weighted targets per route run, which weights air yards and routes run with a scaler included. Primarily use this for the wide receiver position to show which players are getting targeted at different depths and how efficient they're being with their targets. And then high value touches, which is a running back specific metric. It is carries inside the 10-yard line and any reception. And then we'll also be referring to green zone touches, which is any touch, reception, or carry inside the opponent's 10-yard line. And got Crosby in the room here, as you can see him crawling around. But we'll be going through the stats position by position so that I can compare against others in the position and help you make start sit decisions, waiver decisions, potentially your final trade decisions of this season. And then we'll go through a couple of teams more in depth, just looking at their situation as a whole. A couple of final reminders. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and become a member for just $5 a month to get early access to this show, be able to watch it live, get access to the Discord, and a bunch of other benefits as well. And then one final shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who has been amazing in adding timestamps on the YouTube video for each of the positions and the team conversations so that you, the watcher or listener, can skip ahead to whatever conversation or I guess discussion. I don't know if it's really conversation, if it's just me by myself, but whichever one that you want to listen to specifically. So, as I do every single week, I'll be showing a chart on the screen for the video on YouTube. I would highly recommend you watch it on YouTube to be able to see these charts. I usually share some of them on Twitter, but not all of them. And starting off with the quarterback position on the x-axis of this chart have adjusted yards per attempt. On the y-axis have touchdown rate, so that's just touchdowns divided by passing attempts, and then the size of a quarterback's bubble as his rushing yards per game. And looking at efficiency here, because that's what drives quarterback scoring the most, volume is not as much of an indicator for fantasy success for the quarterback position as it is for running back, wide receiver, and tight end. But one quarterback who has not been that efficient the last couple of games specifically is Matthew Stafford. Has played 2 primetime games against the Titans last week and against the 49ers last night, and has just been absolutely abysmal. And in those 2 games, he has a negative 4.8% CPOE. He has a negative 0.18 EPA per play. That's expected points added per play, which is very bad. You want that to be positive. He's thrown only 2 touchdowns and 4 interceptions in those 2 games. He's still throwing it a ton, and they've had to throw it a ton because they've been down in these games so early. And he has over 240 passing yards per game. Over 240 pass yards in each of the 2 games. Had 293, I believe, last week. And as a result of all of these interceptions and the lack of touchdowns, has fewer than 12 points per game across the 2 games, and it has fewer than 24 points in obviously those two games combined. So he's going to be going into his bye week this week. Him and the Rams are. And I'm actually going to talk about the Rams wide receivers later on in the show to sort of dissect what happened last night specifically. Obviously, Robert Woods is out for the season, which I honestly think will hurt Matthew Stafford more than it's being talked about. And maybe that's like the NFL like football guy version of me steaming something, is like, I've seen a lot of people say that Robert Woods missing is a bigger deal. But in any case, I don't think you're sitting Stafford if you have him, except for this week, obviously. But it could potentially be a buy low opportunity now if you've been streaming quarterback all year. If you have someone in place for week 11 and sort of want to solidify the position. I rarely advocate for trading for quarterbacks, especially in 1 quarterback leagues, but Stafford, outside of these 2 games, has been phenomenal this entire year. And I think they have a fairly favorable schedule down the stretch as well. So certainly something to keep an eye on. They do pass the ball a ton again, which I'll get into a little bit more later on. The only other quarterback that I really want to talk about is Trevor Simian, who hasn't been playing terrible, from both a real life and a fantasy football perspective, since taking over for Jameis Winston in week 8 has a negative 4.9% CPOE, which is, that's the bad part, I guess, with Simian, but has not thrown an interception and has thrown 5 touchdowns, has a 4.8% touchdown rate, is averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game in those 3 games, has a 7.8 adjusted yards per attempt, a 0.93 pacer, so he's not getting a ton of help from his receivers, but the Saints do play the Eagles this week. So I do think if you're looking for a Stafford replacement, you could do worse than Trevor Simian. And another option to replace Stafford this week, now that I'm thinking about it and looking, I don't believe he shows up on the chart here, is Cam Newton, just because he didn't have that many actual passing and rushing attempts. But it sounds like Cam Newton is going to, the Panthers are going to do everything that they can to get him to start this upcoming week. I forget who specifically they play, but certainly a couple of names that are likely on your waiver wire to look out for if you're looking for a quarterback replacement this week. The final thing that I'll note with quarterbacks is Josh Allen's average depth of target. I forget that I didn't write down the number specifically, but I remember reading in Ben Gretsch's article or his newsletter, Stealing Signals. Please do subscribe to that. But Josh Allen's average depth of target this past week was the highest in a single game all season. So it's great to see him pushing the ball down the field, and maybe that's a product of them playing the Jets, who do not have a great defense by any stretch, but is certainly good to see and benefits Stefon Diggs. And I'm going to be actually talking about the Bills later on in the episode. A lot of teases today. Okay, the running back position is as fun as ever. And on the x-axis of this chart have rushing expected fantasy points on the x-axis, receiving expected fantasy points on the y-axis, and fantasy points over expectation, or FPO, as the size of the bubble. Obviously one backfield that a lot of people are paying attention to right now in the wake of Derrick Henry going down is the Titans running backs. And it's now been 2 weeks without Henry in the fold. I would be shocked if Henry came back at all this regular season, given the lead that the Titans have in the AFC South, given how easy their schedule is down the stretch, and them being able to piece together some wins with the guys in this backfield. But in week 10, D'Onta Foreman actually was the lead guy for the Titans. He led the backfield in snaps, was at 35%. He led them in carries and total yards. He had 30 rushing yards and 48 receiving yards. So over the past 2 weeks too, again, McNichols seems like he's still the pass catching back. He's got an 11% target share over the past 2 weeks. Has only averaged 3 targets per game, which isn't spectacular by any means, but is running a route on 32% of dropbacks, and I think will continue to solidify that passing work. But if anyone was to take it, I think it would be Foreman. Foreman had 13 total opportunities this past week. McNichols only had 7 and Peterson only had 9. That was after a week in which both McNichols and Peterson had double-digit opportunities. So it sort of looks like Foreman is gaining a little traction in this backfield. He was the lowest in snap share in their Week 9 game at 21%, and that was obviously their first game with Adrian Peterson. But if you look at the snap shares between these two games, Peterson's been at 33% actually both games, and McNichols and Foreman have essentially flip-flopped from Week 9 to Week 10. They've all averaged at least one green zone touch per game, which is probably what's most frustrating across this backfield, is not being able to figure out who the sort of goal line or red zone guy is going to be. The one thing, if someone is offering like a bigger than expected pot for any one of these guys, they're all averaging over the past two games, they all have fewer than 11 total expected points, which I think is a bit of an aberration. The Titans' pass rate over expectation did drop below 0%, which again is encouraging if you have invested in this backfield. And because again, like they've been a run-first offense this entire season with Derrick Henry, with their wide receiver core being so hurt, with A.J. Brown and Julio Jones each missing a couple of games. They also play the Texans this upcoming week, so it could be a huge spot for any one of these players. And I'm going to take sort of a Bayesian approach here and say that Foreman, if you want to start anyone, whether it's from a DFS or a fantasy perspective, Foreman is the guy to play. After the Texans, they face at the New England Patriots. They have a bye week. Then they play the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the 49ers, and the Miami Dolphins to round out their schedule, which is, God, it's crazy that there's only 7 weeks left after this week. 6 more weeks after 7 more weeks? Man, math is hard. In any case, Foreman is my pick. I'd go Foreman, McNichols, Peterson in how I'd rank these guys, because I do think the Titans, their lack of pass catchers makes it could make it easy for McNichols to budge in there and earn a larger target share. Moving on, speaking of a run-first team, the Detroit Lions ran it a ton on Sunday against the Pittsburgh Steelers in that awesome game that ended in a tie. DeAndre Swift was the man of the hour, though. He set season highs in snap share at 93%, at Lions running backs carries at 87%, total touches, which at 36, he had, I believe, 33 carries, which was more than double his career high previously. He had 88 total percent of the backfield touches. He led the Lions in routes run and running a route on 84.3% of dropbacks. Now, they only had, I believe, 25 passes in this game, so not a huge sample there. But again, all of the other running backs for Detroit played on fewer than 10% of the snaps. Now, Jermar Jefferson, I believe, left with an ankle injury partway through the game, opening the door a little bit for, oh gosh, I forgot to check this name before the show, but Godwin Igwebuike. I'm not going to try to pronounce that, but funny enough, they both had a rushing touchdown in the game and Swift didn't. So they certainly made the most of their opportunities. But over the last 2 weeks, both of which have been without Jamal Williams, has been huge for DeAndre Swift. He's, again, averaging 5 high-value touches per game, averaging 20.2 expected points per game, and crazy enough, he's averaging -7 fantasy points over expectation per game. So again, it's because he's getting all of these opportunities and hasn't been able to find the end zone, at least not a rushing touchdown, but he has a 20% target share. He's running around on 74% of dropbacks. His receiving expected points is at 8 per game, which is absolutely phenomenal. That's where we want to see really any workhorse running back. They can get the majority of the carries, but I really want to see them getting work in the passing game. He's averaging 5.5 targets as well. So Jermar Jefferson should be on every team if he isn't already. Godwin, I'm going to call him, is definitely worth a stash if this Jefferson injury is worse than it appears. And I don't know what the timetable to return for Jamal Williams is, but this backfield gives their running backs a ton of high-value touches. And obviously a lot of that is weighted by Swift's opportunity share with high-value touches. But again, if Swift were to go down, God forbid, crossing my fingers that it doesn't, then literally anyone in this backfield could be valuable despite the offense being not that great. The next backfield is not necessarily, it is a backfield, or it was a backfield, and now it's just a back, and it's Christian McCaffrey in the Panthers, because McCaffrey is all the way back. Or is he? That's the question, I think. I mean, he's gotten 19 and 23 opportunities in the past 2 weeks, but his snap share has been at 49% and 59% the past 2 weeks. So he's not, the Panthers are clearly not giving him necessarily the full workload. And it could be a situation like we saw a couple weeks ago with AJ Brown, and how they had him essentially playing a full complement of passing down work, but on the run plays, they took him out because they didn't want to risk further injury, which I think is a smart way to play it. And the Panthers were very far ahead in this game early on, forced a couple of turnovers against the Cardinals, and Christian McCaffrey should have just had like a monster game. Cam Newton back from the dead, it sounds like, vultured a goal line touch from him, and then passed to Robbie Anderson, who was also back from the dead. But in any case, McCaffrey did run a route on 67% of the team's dropbacks, which is his highest rate of the season, including the 2 full healthy games that he played in weeks 1 and 2. So that's certainly good to see. He got 10 receptions this past week, is averaging 7 over the last 2 weeks. The one guy to keep an eye on in this backfield is Amir Abdullah, because he has, it seems like he's sort of eclipsed Chuba Hubbard in the pecking order for the backfield. This past week, he had 13 total opportunities. It's the second week that he's had more opportunities than Chuba Hubbard. Abdullah has been at a 37% and 21% snap share the past 2 weeks, while Hubbard was at 17 and 21%. So the same for week 10, but 4 more opportunities in this game. Has gotten 9 total targets over the last 2 games, has 4.5 9 high value touches over the last 2 weeks as well, compared to just 3 for Hubbard. So it seems like there's a bit of a changing of the guard. So if Abdullah is out there in your league, again, especially heading into the playoffs where handcuffs, I believe, add, in my opinion, a lot more value from a floor perspective. If Abdullah is out there, most certainly worth an add and worth a peek to see if he's out on your waiver wire. A couple of other nuggets at the running back position before I move on to wide receivers. This is from John Daigle. He noted that Michael Carter's 16 carries, 20 touches, and 60.6% share of backfield touches were his most in a game with Tevin Coleman this year, which is great to see because we hadn't seen Carter in a bell cow role while Coleman had been in the lineup. And I'll be interested to see where Carter gets drafted next year. He'll likely fall in the running back dead zone, but don't hold me to this, but I could see him having a Swift-like season potentially with being in a bad offense, his ADP getting depressed a little bit, and having just the majority of the backfield opportunities, especially if he's getting the passing down work. Had a question in the Discord to talk about the Packers running backs. Aaron Jones is going to be out for a couple of weeks. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see him until after the Packers bye in a couple of weeks. But Kylan Hill is out for the year as well. So Patrick Taylor, running back for the Packers, is worth an add, especially for running back needy teams. He only had 2 carries in the game this past week, but he did have one of those was a green zone touch. And, that Packers team it seems like they want to run the ball a bit more, but A.J. Dillon had, 23 total opportunities in the game with Aaron Jones going down partway through it. So just A.J. Dillon's going to be a smash for the next couple weeks as Aaron Jones recuperates from his injury. Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, and the mentor, Darrel Williams, were all tied for the league lead in high-value touches with 11 in Week 10. And I point this out because Williams has had at least 7 high-value touches in his last 3 games, but it sounds like CEH could possibly be back this week. If he's not, then Williams is definitely a solid start again this week. In the first game without Chase Edmonds, a lot of eyes were on James Conner, and he got 14 opportunities compared to just 7 opportunities for Benjamin. But Conner did play on a season-high 82% of snaps and ran a route on over 50% of snaps for the second straight week. So Conner still looking every bit the workhorse while Edmonds is out. Note from Ben in his in his newsletter again about Antonio Gibson coming off the bye, had his highest snap share since week 1, had all 5 of the green zone touches, but his routes weren't quite as high as the first few weeks. So a sign that his injury is improving and he's getting healthier, but I think it's a bit of a lost cause of us wanting to have him get the full receiving workload that McKissick gets. Final note, a couple of notes from Davis Maddock, actually. Since returning from injury, Elijah Mitchell is 6th amongst all running backs in fantasy points over expectations and is 5th in the NFL in rushing yards per game. And since that time, Trey Sermon, this really got me. Trey Sermon has more tackles with 2 than he has carries, which is 1 since Mitchell returned from injury. So There was some news this afternoon too that Mitchell, I think, broke his finger and was getting surgery on it. So there's no, I don't know if there's a timetable to return for him yet, but I mean, I was ready to say that Trey Sermon was dead, but if Mitchell is in fact out, Sermon is worth picking up, but Jeff Wilson is definitely the primary guy that should be on teams regardless, because he got a fair share of work last night against the Rams. Okay, moving on to the wide receiver position here. On the x-axis of this chart have weighted targets per route run. On the y-axis have air yards market share, and then the size of their bubble is fantasy points over expectation. Going to start this section off talking about the Jaguars wide receivers because it's bleak, at least for us Visca fans. But since DJ Chark went down, this is how sort of the last 5 weeks are panning out. Jamal Agnew of the wide receivers leads the team with a 19% target share. Marvin Jones is second at 18%, and Laviska is third at 16%. Jones is running a route on 91% of dropbacks. Both Agnew and Shenault are at 73%. They're all averaging between 5.5 and 7.5 targets per game, which is not a ton, obviously, and is not something to base consistency off of. Jamal Agnew did have a 70-yard touchdown rush this past week, which was pretty crazy. It saved his week. He's had double-digit PPR points in now it looks like 5 of the last 6 weeks. So I guess there's a little bit of consistency there. Marvin Jones hasn't eclipsed double digits in each of the last 3 weeks either. And I think somewhat good news for Shenault is that his average depth of target was up to 8.1 yards this past week. That was his highest since week 5, which was the first game without Chark, when it was at 9.67. So got some more downfield targets, but is still the sort of short area target. His both him and Agnew are at have an ADOT below 7 yards, while Jones is at 13.6 yards. So from a consistency standpoint, and this is what's difficult, because there are, I think, some opportunities for some boom weeks here with the Jaguars wide receivers. I would tend to lean towards Marvin Jones having the opportunity to have, again, one of those boom weeks. He's had over 100 air yards in 3 of his last 5 games, has over 50 in each of his last 5 games, has had at least 5 targets in the last 3 games. So again, that's not a huge number of targets, but there's some consistency there. And again, the big thing for me is the 91% route per dropback rate that he has. Jones also has a 0.48 weighted targets per route run, which is below average. And I think that sort of shows you sort of how bad overall these receivers can be. Agnew actually is above that at 0.52, but all of those below the median mark here on the chart over the last 5 weeks, and is probably at this point something to stay away from if possible. The next group of receivers, and it's really just one receiver, and it's a cover boy, DeVonta Smith. The Eagles, and I want to talk about him specifically because the Eagles want to run the shit out of the ball. Their pass rate over expectations has been at negative 13% or lower in each of the last 4 weeks, which is just dead last. They are content running the ball as much as they want. And I guess the good news is that Quez Watkins, Jalen Reagor, and Smith are the only 3 receivers on this team getting targets. Obviously, Dallas Goedert, the tight end there, is not included in that as well. But none of these players have more than 6 targets in a game over the last 3 weeks. And that's even worse than what we saw with the Jaguars. But the good news, and why I think DeVonta can continue to thrive, is one, he's an excellent playmaker. He's a better receiver than anyone on the Jaguars that I just mentioned. He has a 41% air yard share over the last 4 weeks, over that stretch of games that I mentioned with the Eagles passing the ball a ton. A 41% air yard share, 28% target share, a 0.68 Whopper, a weighted targets per out run of 0.73, which is, near the top over the last several weeks, and had that fantastic touchdown catch in the game this past week. I believe, if I remember correctly, that was like the touchdown with the smallest window thrown into this entire season, and just made a spectacular grab. He's obviously better than Reagor and Watkins at this point. Over his last 5 games, Smith has been at 98 air yards or more in 3 of his last 4. He has, and this is funny, Smith has exactly 22.6 fantasy PPR points in his last 2 games, in each of his last 2 games. And this is following his week 8 where he only had 2.5. So really coming alive at the right time here. But I think, and I might have talked about this group a couple of weeks ago, Quez Watkins is clearly the number 2 receiver in this offense now. He's averaging just under 4 targets per game in the last 4 games, but Reagor is just under 2 targets per game, has just an 8% target share and 7% of the air yards in that stretch. Reagor's only running a route on 71% of dropbacks, while Watkins is pretty much neck and neck with Smith at 90%. So Watkins and Smith, probably the only 2 Eagles wide receivers worth rostering right now, again, given how little they want to pass the ball. But again, they might be forced to pass the ball in some of the weeks to come. We'll see about that. On the flip side, a team that loves passing the ball is the Chiefs. And I rarely talk about the Chiefs and teams like the Chiefs because we pretty much have them figured out. But I thought it was time to take a look because Patrick Mahomes kind of looked like his old self the other night for parts of the game, and wanted to see if there is any value in any of the receivers behind Tyreek Hill, who's having just a phenomenal season once again. In the last 5 games, averaging over 12 targets per game. It's a 27% target share, 38% air yard share, over 132 air yards per game. He's just crushing it. So I'm not going to talk about Hill. Who I want to talk about are the receivers behind him, because it's been a bit of a mix between Demarcus Robinson, Byron Pringle, and Mecole Hardman. And Josh Gordon has just done nothing for this team. He just has 3 total targets in the last 3 games and doesn't have any catches. He he's not worth rostering if he was still on your roster. But in any case, the thing to note here is that Mecole Hardman this past week ran a route on only 33% of dropbacks, which is by far a season low. His lowest before that was at 59%, which was just 2 weeks ago in week 8. But this is the first time or second time, I guess, that it's been below 60%. Meanwhile, Byron Pringle had a season high 67% route rate in week 10 after not being above 50% in any week before this past week. So again, if we're looking at this one game, it looks like Byron Pringle may have supplanted Mecole Hardman. And Pringle had 73 air yards in this game. He had 121 air yards back in week 7 and is just sort of looking better than Pringle at this point. Over the last 5 weeks, Pringle's at a 9% target share. Mecole Hardman's at a 12% target share. And I do think that Pringle is worth an ad at this point. It's not exciting, and I don't think I'd slot him into a lineup right away. But if this continues, then he's basically Mecole Hardman. And I think, there's obviously been a lot of hype around Mecole Hardman in the past, and Pringle has a 0.45 weighted targets per route run over the last 5 weeks. Mecole Hardman's just at 0.38. So getting slightly more work in that regard. Pringle's averaging about an expected point per game over the last 5 weeks as well. So just sort of reading the tea leaves here, and it seems like, and it could have been because the Chiefs were up so big and they wanted to get Pringle more involved. But I tend to lean that, again, they kept Tyreek Hill in there for quite a while as well. And so I think Pringle is worth an ad here. Okay, I mentioned it earlier. I'm going to talk about the Rams wide receiver situation here a little bit. OBJ, Odell Beckham Jr. was in the lineup. Obviously got traded to the Rams last week. He was in the lineup, but only ran a route on 25% of the team's dropbacks, had 3 targets, caught 2 of them for 18 yards, had 68 air yards. Obviously had that long, deep shot that Stafford threw the ugly pick on, but just didn't really play enough to get a sense of how he's going to be used. Like I mentioned, the Rams enter their bye week this week and then get the Packers, the Jaguars, Cardinals, and Seahawks. So maybe that gives them more time to have Odell Beckham Jr. adjust to this offense, because I'm sure it's much, much different than what he was doing with the Browns. But the other persons, I guess, to talk about are Van Jefferson and someone named Ben Skowronek. And Skowronek, I'm just going to call him Ben. Ben had 5 targets last night. Jefferson did have 7 targets of his own, and Jefferson has had at least 6 targets in each of the last 4 weeks. Jefferson ran a route on 97% of dropbacks and has been above 88% in each of the last 4 weeks. He is actually averaging, last night he had 17.5 expected fantasy points and had -9 fantasy points over expectation because he dropped a touchdown and a couple other passes as well. But on the season, he has played pretty decent and is getting, for sure, a full share of routes. And I think will continue to do so with Robert Woods, like I mentioned, being out for the year here. So we'll see if Stafford ends up trusting Jefferson after a couple of bad drops. But I'm not really worried about the ancillary pieces here because the Rams have had a positive pass rate over expectation in every single game this season, and they're fourth in pass rate over expectation since week 7. So Jefferson, again, certainly worth rostering, and I think could be a viable flex play in the right spot. And Odell Beckham Jr., I might wait until after they play the Packers to see what he looks like in that game before plugging him into my lineup. Cooper Kupp, as solid as ever, had 13 targets for the third time in the last 4 games, and the fourth time this season has double-digit targets in every single game except week 8, and is just blowing out the water. Didn't quite get you there last night without a touchdown, but he's still a stud and one of the fantasy MVPs of the season. A couple of, again, final nuggets on the wide receiver position. In his first game back, Michael Gallup saw 5 targets and ran a route on 58% of dropbacks. He had a really nice long catch that he almost scored on. So really good to see him back. If he was, for whatever reason, dropped in your league, be sure to go snatch him up this week. In the past 2 games without Henry Ruggs, here's how the Raiders' target shares are fleshing out. Hunter Renfrow has a 22.6% target share. Darren Waller at 21.9%. And then nobody else is above 13%. And it's Kenyon Drake at 12.9%. Josh Jacobs at 11.4%, Bryan Edwards at 10%, and Zay Jones at 8.5%. So it seems like Renfrow and Waller are just going to get boosted up without anyone really taking over the Henry Ruggs role, if you will. Deshaun Jackson had a long catch against the Chiefs Sunday night and then fumbled it. And then walked off the sideline visibly frustrated. But we'll be interested to see if he gets any more run in the games to come. T.Y. Hilton did run a season-high 72% of routes and had 5 targets and looked pretty decent, I guess. So yeah, worth keeping an eye on Hilton for. And then this from Ben Gretsch. Elijah Moore found the end zone late, but ran a route on just 52% of dropbacks. Corey Davis was back and returned to a full role, running a route on more than 90% of dropbacks, I believe. And Jamison Crowder had a season-high routes run share. So I don't really understand. I mean, he sort of split the wide receiver 3 role with Keel and Cole. Hopefully that sort of smooths itself out and more sort of solidifies himself as the wide receiver 3, but something to monitor for sure. Now, wrapping up the position-specific conversations with someone who seems like the talk of the town these days. The football cognoscenti is having a field day with Dan Arnold right now. And all it took was getting him away from Sam Darnold for him to thrive. Over the last, there are 2 tight ends that have scored at least 10 PPR fantasy points in each of their last 3 games. That's Dan Arnold and Evan Ingram. That's from Heath Cummings over at CBS. And then Adam Levitan pointed out over his last 5 games, his target share has been above 20% in each of those 5 games and has been at over 20% in 3 of those 5 games. So truly an elite target share for a tight end. Overall, in those 5 games, has a 20% target share, is averaging 7.5 targets per game, which again is phenomenal. His routes per dropback rate has risen in each of the last 4 games he's had, topping out at 81%. This past weekend is averaging 10 PPR points per game. So for a tight end, that makes him a tight end 1. And it is really just playing solidly for sure. I think will be interesting to see his price for DFS this week, because he's been below 4K, I believe, the last several weeks, and has been a smash at that price. But we'll see where it's there. Had a request from Timu in the Discord to talk about Trautman's season, and I was confused and I thought I missed something, but nope. Trautman still kind of bad. Has not scored above 10 PPR points at all this season. Had 8.2 this past week, 8.7 the week before. And maybe this is what he's talking about, but he's had at least 6 targets in each of the last 3 weeks, which sort of coincides with Simian started. And yeah, I mean, he has that many targets, which again, I talked about. I just mentioned Darrel at 7.5 per game in his last 5. I mean, just over 6 per game is pretty solid for a tight end as well. And Juwan Johnson is pretty much a non-factor at this point, after looking like he could have a solid role entering the season. But what's really weird about Trautman too is that he was at a 57.5% routes run rate this past week, which is the first time that it's dipped below 66% since week 4. So I don't really get it. I would not trust Trautman in my lineup. I don't think that offense has nearly as high of a ceiling as it once did. Speaking of players that are back and tight ends that are really good, George Kittle is all the way fucking back. He leads the team with a 26% target share and 34% air yards share the past 2 weeks. He scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. And I think the concerns remain the same with him as they have with Debo, that I pointed out. You know, they're not a pass-heavy offense. The target tree is more condensed, which is good. And you'll take variance at tight end when you're getting spike weeks like George Kittle can provide. But it's just good to see George Kittle back and thriving. Final note here, in the first game without Jonnu Smith, sort of a surprise inactive this past week. Hunter Henry's role didn't actually change that much. He was above a 70% routes run rate for the 3rd time this season, but still hasn't had more than 4 targets in each of the last 5 games. But he's managed to score 5 touchdowns in that span. So just crushing every efficiency metric by that rate. If Smith is out for the game against the Falcons this Thursday night, then Hunter Henry is for sure should be locked into your lineups. Yeah, you can see, I mean, I'm looking at these charts, like George Kittle is just at the top right of both of these and is just crushing it, right next to Kyle Pitts. Have a day, George Kittle. All right, wrapping up the show here, we're going to talk about the Buffalo Bills, starting with Josh Allen, coming off of the down week against the Jaguars, just absolutely crushed it against the Jets. The Bills are top 3 in pass rate over expectation on the season and top 3 since week 7. So they are content passing the ball and passing the ball a ton, especially when they get up big, which is the key, and which is what pass rate over expectation is intended to sort of weed out and try. And that's what we should be looking for. But Since the Week 7 bye for Josh Allen, which has been 3 games for them, he has a 5.4% CPOE, 3.4% touchdown rate, 7.0 adjusted yards per attempt, and 7.6 average depth of target. Like I mentioned earlier, that crept up a little bit this past week. But the other interesting thing is that Allen's only had 4.3 carries per game in these last 3 weeks, but he's still averaging 36 rushing yards per game. So not worried that that's not really, staying a part of his game. The running back position for the Buffalo Bills, always a lot of eyes on that. And Matt Breida frustratingly had a rushing touchdown and I believe a receiving touchdown, and basically just took the opportunities away from the other running backs this past week, but only played on 14% of snaps, and he could be worth an add. I think is more of a handcuff probably to Devin Singletary, because Devin Singletary's snap share dropped down to 38% after being at 72% in week 9, but not someone I'm super eager to go after, given the fact that the Bills running backs are not targeted at a high rate. And again, like I mentioned, the Bills are not running the ball a ton either. Over the last 3 weeks, Singletary and Moss are both averaging fewer than 7 carries per game. They're actually both averaging right around 10 opportunities per game. I think some of that's inflated by the week 9 and Singletary getting a little bit more work with Zach Moss leaving that game for a little bit. And again, these two are sort of what they always have been. Zach Moss is slightly more valuable because he's consistently been playing since week 1 a higher snap share and gets the goal line work, as well as averaging over 1 green zone touch per game, while Singletary has just 1 green zone touch total in the last 3 weeks. The pass catchers for the Buffalo Bills, Stefon Diggs had his best game of the season this past week, which was phenomenal. Great for the ship chasing crew. Had 13 targets, 208 air yards. He ran a route on over 90% of dropbacks for just the second time this season, and the first time since week 1. So really, I hope the downfield targeting and the sort of target share concentrating on Diggs continues to hold. But over the last 3 weeks, he still has a really solid 25% target share, 34% air yard share, is averaging over 100 air yards per game, has scored 2 touchdowns, and is averaging just over 9 targets per game, has a 0.64 weighted targets per route run. Behind him, it's Cole Beasley, who actually only had 2 targets this past week after 2 straight weeks with at least 11 targets. His routes run share dropped to 25.8%, in week 10, which is by far a season low. The first time he's been below 55% in a game this season. It's dropped each of the last 4 weeks, going from 91% to 80 to 63, and now 26% this past week. So not sure what's going on there. And then Emmanuel Sanders, I think, has sort of come back down to earth after his big start. And it's probably just the efficiency coming down, because he still has about a 17-yard average depth of target over the last 3 weeks, but he's averaging fewer than 5 targets per game, and he still has yet to record a game with more than 8 targets in a game. So that's sort of where you get the boom and the bust with a receiver like that, with such a high average depth of target, but not consistently getting targets. But again, he's still running the most routes on the team, which is the somewhat confusing part. Has run a route on 89%, of dropbacks the last 3 weeks. I do think it will return, I guess, sort of bounce. He'll have a minor bounce back eventually, because he's had over 100 air yards in 3 of his last 4 games. That's, except for week 10, he only had 22. So certainly something to keep an eye on. Dawson Knox was also back in this game, ran a route on 74% of dropbacks, which is good to see. Only had the 1 target, but that's again sort of to be expected with just a tight end in general, and one coming back from injury. All right, final team, the Los Angeles Chargers. So it's getting a little sore here, pushing through. But Justin Herbert, the Chargers, I believe, have lost 3 of the last 4. Not sure what's going on with them. There's an article on PFF I still got to read through, talking about some of these changes, but it hasn't necessarily been Justin Herbert's fault, because they're having him throw it much shorter than he had in the past. Has just a 6.9 average depth of target over the last 3 weeks. Has a 7.0 yard adjusted yards per attempt, 4.7% touchdown rate, negative 1.2% CPOE, but is still averaging 243 passing yards per game. So Herbert, like, from a fantasy perspective, Herbert's fine. I think for him to really unlock his ceiling, though, need to get back to targeting Mike Williams, who I'll talk about here in a second, and targeting him downfield as well. As far as the running back position, Austin Eckler still holding strong in the driver's seat in that backfield. But again, going to take a quick look at sort of the handcuffs again here, because that's what I think is the most valuable. And Justin Jackson, I think, is sort of irrelevant at this point. He hasn't had an opportunity in the last 2 games. And Joshua Kelly and Larry Roundtree have sort of flip-flopped in each of the last 2 weeks. In week 9, Kelly had 4 opportunities and now just 1 this past week, while Roundtree was at 1 in week 9 and 5 in week 10. But Roundtree has consistently had some goal line opportunities, has 2 green zone touches in the past 3 weeks, and 1 in each of the last 2 weeks. So I'm prioritizing Roundtree for sure as the handcuff to Austin Eckler for the rest of the season. Finally, the pass catchers. Mike Williams, like I mentioned, he's down bad right now. Had a scorching hot start to the season, but has cooled off quite a bit. Doesn't have more than 6 targets in each of the last 4 games after having double-digit targets in 3 of his first 5 games. Meanwhile, Keenan Allen has been above 11 targets in each of the last 3 games. But again, the good thing for Williams is that his routes run rate has risen in each of the last 3 weeks and topped out at a 97% rate in week 10, which was the exact same as Keenan Allen. In fact, his route run rate the last 2 weeks have both been above 92%, which are both or were both season highs at the time. So he's still out there running a ton of routes, just is not consistently getting the targets. His average depth of target, in fact, over the last 3 weeks, and again, this is more a function of the offense than I really think his role, but his average depth of target is at 8.25, while Keenan Allen is at 8 yards as well. So it's really just the targets that aren't there for Mike Williams. And you can sort of see here with the weighted targets per out run, and I don't have obviously the receiver chart up here, but Williams over the last 3 weeks is at 0.35. Keenan Allen has double that at 0.72. Williams is averaging -3 fantasy points over expectation per game over the last 3 weeks, which isn't a huge amount, but it is something. Sort of showing that he's not fully taking advantage of those opportunities. But behind those two, it's a bit of a guessing game as to who the wide receiver 3 is, whether it's Jalen Guyton or Josh Palmer. Would probably lean Guyton just because he's running around on over 50% of dropbacks, but neither of them have more than, looks like, 5 targets in a single game this season. So not really from a fantasy perspective worth looking at. Jared Cook has averaged 4 targets per game over the last 3 weeks as well, and I think is still clearly ahead of, unfortunately, Donald Chicken Parham. All right. That is almost going to do it for the show today, despite Crosby whining and wanting me to get out of here. I do have one last thing to address. Had a question from a listener last week that I forgot to answer. This is from Pete Roverzet. He said, "I'll take my answer on air. How do you feel about someone calling you the data daddy?" And look, that comes with the job. When you're digging through all these stats and want to talk about metrics, routes run, target share, air yard share, it's the data is my baby, and I'm the data daddy. It's been a joy to do this and to share all these stats with the listeners. I am going to take my bye week next week, do a little R&R during the Thanksgiving week, spend some much needed time with the family. Hope you all have a great holiday as well and can take advantage of some extra rest. But remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member for just $5 a month. Like this video and subscribe to the YouTube. Check in with the guys tomorrow at 9:15 p.m. Eastern time, and have a great week 11.